There was a version of California that no longer exists. You can't visit it, you can't GPS it, you can't find it on any map printed after 1989. But if you grew up here, or if you've ever stared long enough at an old photograph of a strip mall at dusk, palm trees backlit in amber, a Jack-in-the-Box sign glowing red and white against a darkening sky, then somewhere in you, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. This is the story of fast food in 1980s California. Not the calories, not the corporate history, the experience, the feeling, the world that those restaurants were part of, and what it meant that they were there at all. Because here's what most people who write about this era miss entirely. Fast food in 1980s California wasn't just food. It was infrastructure. It was ritual. It was one of the few places in American life where absolutely everyone was welcome. Kids, families, teenagers with nowhere to be, old men with a cup of coffee and a newspaper and absolutely nowhere they needed to go either. And it operated with a kind of analog warmth that we didn't have a name for then. We just called it Tuesday. To understand what fast food meant in 1980s California, you have to understand the world those restaurants existed inside. California in 1980 was the most populous state in the country and the most sprawling. There was no Uber, no DoorDash, no phone in your pocket telling you what was open and how far away it was. You got in the car, you drove, and the landmarks you navigated by weren't the ones on any official map. They were the McDonald's Arch on Sepulveda, the Carl's Jr. Star on Harbor Boulevard, the Jack-in-the-Box Clown, the original one, the unsettling one, perched on a pole 15 feet in the air on El Camino Real. These signs were the constellations of the California suburban landscape. You knew where you were because of them. California was also, in the early 1980s, the fastest-growing fast food market in the world. McDonald's had over 700 California locations by 1983. Jack-in-the-Box, which was born in San Diego in 1951, had roots here that went deeper than anywhere else on Earth. Carl's Jr. was a pure California invention, started by Carl Karcher from a hot dog cart in Los Angeles in 1941. Del Taco and Taco Bell both came out of Southern California soil. This wasn't a state that imported its fast food culture from somewhere else. California invented it. And in the 1980s, that invention was in full, glorious bloom. Here is something nobody ever said out loud in 1983, but everybody understood without being told. Fast food restaurants in 1980s California were governed by an invisible set of rules, social rules, unspoken architecture that determined who sat where, when, and why. There was the after-school hour, roughly 2:30 to 4:30 p.m., when the McDonald's on whatever main street ran through your suburb transformed from a lunch spot into something closer to a community center. Backpacks piled on orange plastic chairs, a large Coke split 4 ways with 4 straws, homework spread across the table in a way that suggested homework was maybe happening. The manager, usually a guy in his late 20s who'd been there long enough to have seen generations of high schoolers pass through, letting it all go because this was just how Tuesday worked. There was the family hour, 5 to 7, minivans in the parking lot, kids who'd been promised this if they made it through soccer practice without a meltdown. The Happy Meal, introduced in 1979 and still new enough in 1980 to feel like a genuine event, sitting in its red box like a delivered promise.
There was the late-night hour, the one that existed in the gap after the movie let out and before anyone wanted the night to be over. Jack-in-the-Box was the king of this hour because Jack-in-the-Box never closed. In 1980s California, Jack-in-the-Box was open 24 hours, one of the very few fast food chains that was, and that meant something. It meant there was always somewhere to go, always a place that had its lights on. That's not a small thing. In a world without smartphones, without the infinite scroll, the knowledge that somewhere, a mile away, a building had its lights on and would hand you a jumbo jack at 2 in the morning was a specific kind of comfort. Irrational, maybe, but real. Nobody designed these rituals. Nobody wrote them down. They emerged from the architecture of the restaurants, the layout of the suburbs, and the patterns of California life. That's what invisible architecture means. It shapes everything and announces itself nowhere. Let's talk about McDonald's, because you cannot talk about fast food in 1980s California without stopping here for a while. McDonald's in 1983 was not the McDonald's of today. The menu was shorter. The sizes were smaller. A large Coke in 1982 is what we'd call a medium today. The interiors were warmer, literally warmer, in color temperature, all burnt orange and harvest gold and brown, a color palette that feels like the decade itself. The Big Mac had been on the menu since 1968, but in 1980s California, it was still the flagship, the thing you ordered when you wanted the full experience. Kids who couldn't finish a Big Mac yet were working toward it the way they worked toward other milestones. The McRib arrived in 1981. Let that land for a moment. The first time anyone ever held a McRib, they were in 1981. It was served on a hoagie roll with barbecue sauce and onions and pickles, and it was bizarre, and it was delicious, and it was everywhere on California radio for about 5 minutes, and then it was gone, pulled from the menu in 1985, brought back occasionally in later years, always as an event. That rhythm, the limited time offer, the seasonal return, the thing that was available and then wasn't, was actually new in the 1980s. McDonald's had pioneered the concept of the LTO, the limited time offer, and in 1980s California, it created something powerful. It made fast food feel like an occasion. There was also something specific happening in the California McDonald's experience that didn't exist in the same way elsewhere: the play structure. McDonald's began installing play structures in the late 1970s, and through the 1980s, the California locations, especially the suburban ones with space for it, became the first genuinely family-designed fast food environments in American history. Not just a place to bring kids, a place built for them, with a structure outside in the warm California air and a parent who could sit at a window table with a coffee and watch without having to be in it. That design decision changed the relationship between fast food and the American family in ways that are still with us. And it happened here first.
Jack in the Box is the most California of all the major fast food chains. It was born here, in San Diego, in 1951, when Robert Peterson drove a station wagon to a piece of land on El Cajon Boulevard, built a small drive-thru box, installed an intercom system with a clown-shaped speaker, and called it Jack in the Box. The intercom was the point. This was one of the first fast food restaurants in America designed specifically around the drive-thru concept, before drive-thru was even a phrase people used. You talked to the clown took your order, you drove around and picked it up. By the 1980s, Jack in the Box had grown into one of the dominant California chains, with a particular presence in Southern California that felt almost like civic infrastructure. If you grew up in the LA basin in the 1980s, Jack in the Box was simply there. Multiple locations per suburb, open all night, priced for teenagers and working people. The menu in the 1980s was different from what it is today. There were tacos, those little deep-fried things with the mystery meat and the single piece of American cheese and the taco sauce that nobody could identify, but everybody somehow craved. They cost about 39 cents. People bought them by the bag. There was the Jumbo Jack, the anchor burger, the thing that anchored 1,000 late-night parking lot conversations. And there was the Breakfast Jack, introduced as Jack in the Box pushed into the breakfast wars of the early 1980s, competing directly with McDonald's Egg McMuffin for the morning commuter dollar on the 405 and the 5 and the 10. Something happened to Jack in the Box in 1980 that most people have forgotten. They blew up the clown. In a televised advertising campaign, the company, repositioning itself towards an adult demographic, literally detonated the Jack in the Box mascot.
The clown exploded, gone. The company was moving upmarket, chasing the adult customer, trying to shed its kid-friendly image. For most of the 1980s, Jack in the Box operated without its iconic mascot. It was a decision that made sense on a spreadsheet. And it was a decision that quietly removed something from the California landscape, a piece of visual culture that people had grown up with, that they'd given directions by, that they'd recognized from the back seat of their parents' car since before they could read. These are the decisions that shape a culture without anyone asking permission.
If McDonald's was the institution and Jack in the Box was the all-night friend, Carl's Jr. was something else entirely. Carl's Jr. was California's burger. Carl Karcher had started selling hot dogs from a cart on a Los Angeles street corner in 1941. By the 1980s, he had built Carl's Jr. into a California empire, hundreds of locations concentrated almost entirely in the state, with a product philosophy that distinguished itself from McDonald's in one specific way: size. Carl's Jr. made big burgers, real burgers, the famous Star, the Western Bacon Cheeseburger, introduced in 1983, a construction of beef and bacon and cheese and onion rings that was so aggressively Californian in its excess that it became a kind of regional identity marker. If you ordered a Western Bacon Cheeseburger in 1984, you were making a statement. You were saying, "I am from here. This is how we eat." Carl's Jr. in the 1980s also had something the others didn't: a char-broiled cooking method that produced a specific smell. If you drove past a Carl's Jr. with your windows down, and in 1980s California you always had your windows down, you knew exactly what that smell was. You'd known it since you were 7. Smell is the most powerful memory trigger the human brain has. Neuroscientists call it olfactory memory, and it's stored differently from visual or verbal memory, more directly, more emotionally, which means that somewhere in the archived sensory memory of every Californian who grew up in the 1980s, that smell is still there, still intact, still connected to a specific exit on a specific freeway on a specific Saturday afternoon when the whole weekend was still ahead. You can't Google that. You can only remember it. No story about fast food in California can skip the taco chains, because California was not Kansas. California had a food culture shaped by Mexican culinary tradition, by the enormous Mexican-American population that had been here long before the freeways, by the proximity to the border and the agriculture that filled the Central Valley, that made a specific kind of fast food not just possible, but inevitable. Taco Bell was founded in Downey in 1962 by Glenn Bell, who had watched Richard and Mac McDonald build their system and applied the same logic to Mexican-inspired food. By the 1980s, Taco Bell was everywhere in California, and it was cheap in a way that made it the default choice for a specific demographic: high school students with $3.45. The Taco Bell menu in the early 1980s was simpler than it is today. Tacos, burritos, tostadas, the enchilado, that hybrid burrito-enchilada thing that existed for years and then disappeared and that people still mourn to this day. The prices were measured in individual coins. You could eat at Taco Bell in 1982 for under $1 and feel like you'd had a meal. Del Taco was different. Born in Yermo, California in 1964, a tiny desert town on the way to Las Vegas, Del Taco had a specific California character that Taco Bell, which had gone national and corporate, sometimes felt like it had traded away. Del Taco still had that regional quality. The menu felt like it was written by someone who actually lived here. The Del Taco fish taco, the cheeseburger, a full beef burger at a taco chain, which made a specific kind of California logic. The red and green burritos, priced so low they felt almost like a mistake. If you grew up in the Inland Empire or San Bernardino County in the 1980s, Del Taco wasn't a choice. It was the answer to the question, "Where are we going?" before anyone even finished asking it. Here is something that almost never gets said when people talk about fast food nostalgia. Those restaurants were full of people, not just customers, workers. In 1984, fast food was the single largest employer of teenagers in California. More California teenagers had their first job experience inside a McDonald's or a Jack in the Box or a Carl's Jr. than in any other industry. Not retail, not grocery, fast food. Think about what that means. It means that a specific kind of American education was happening in those kitchens. The education of show up on time, do your task, be decent to the person next to you even when the fryer is backed up and someone just sent back a special order and the manager's radio is making that sound. There were also the career workers, the ones who weren't passing through. The woman who had been opening a McDonald's at 5:30 a.m. since 1975 and would still be there in 1992. The man who had managed a Jack in the Box through 3 different ownership changes and 2 recessions and knew every regular by order and by name. These people were the living memory of these places. They remembered the menu items that came and went. They remembered the customers who used to come in and didn't anymore. They were the institutional knowledge of an institution that nobody ever thought to document. We were too busy eating. We didn't think to look up.
And then some things were gone. Not with an announcement, not with a farewell. They were simply there one season, and then they weren't. And the menu board had been reprinted, and nobody put up a sign that said, "The thing you liked is over." This is the specific cruelty of fast food loss. It's not like a restaurant closing, where there's a sign in the window and a last visit and a version of a goodbye. It's a Wednesday in 1986 when you go to order the thing you always order, and the person behind the counter tells you they don't have that anymore, and you go home, and eventually you stop thinking about it. And years later, something, a smell, a temperature, a specific quality of late afternoon light, pulls it back up without warning. The McRib left California menus in 1985. The first time. McDonald's had sold it since 1981, and for 4 years it had been a fixture, that bizarre barbecued pork sandwich that looked like a cartoon of a rack of ribs and tasted like nothing else on the menu. Gone. The McDonald's onion nuggets, breaded, fried onion pieces sold as a side item in the early 1980s, disappeared before most people realized they'd been there. Jack in the Box had a menu item called the Moby Jack, a fish sandwich that was a fixture through the early 1980s, discontinued, gone. The Taco Bell Enchilado, that layered enchilada burrito hybrid with the olives and the cheese and the red sauce, was discontinued in the late 1980s as the menu rationalized toward cleaner, faster items. Carl's Jr. had a breakfast burrito in the early 1980s before breakfast burritos were everywhere, a specific, particular thing, discontinued. And then there were the experiences. The drive-thru speaker with the static. The one where the voice on the other end sounded like it was coming from a great distance, like a transmission from another decade. Before the digital clarity, before the headsets, there was genuine radio-era audio quality on a fast food intercom, and it sounded like the future was calling from the past. The tray liners. This sounds small. It isn't. In the 1980s, McDonald's and other chains produced tray liners, the paper that lined the plastic tray your food arrived on, that were designed as media, games, puzzles, stories, Ronald McDonald adventures, seasonal promotions. You ate your meal while the tray liner was right there in front of you, and it was designed for the specific amount of time a family with children ate a fast food meal. Not scrolling, not watching. Reading a piece of paper a graphic designer had spent real time making. Nobody said, "This is the last good tray liner." They just got simpler over time, and then they were just paper, and the thing that had been there was gone without anyone marking it. The analog texture of these places, the physical, sensory, unhurried texture was what was really disappearing. Not all at once, incrementally, one small decision at a time. There is a specific experience that California essentially invented and the rest of America borrowed. The drive-thru. Not the concept, the culture. California's car culture meant that the drive-thru wasn't a convenience in the 1980s, it was a social ritual. It was the architecture of a specific kind of American freedom, the freedom to get what you wanted without getting out of your car, without having a conversation longer than 30 seconds, without making a plan or sitting down or committing to anything except the window. The drive-thru in 1980s California had its own unwritten rules. You knew your order before you pulled up to the speaker. This was non-negotiable. You'd made your decision on the approach. The person behind you was watching. You pulled forward when the car ahead moved. You didn't jump ahead of the window sequence. The window handed you your bag and you drove forward, and you didn't sit there sorting through it. That was a different kind of Californian who existed and was universally understood to be wrong about how this worked. And there was the wait. The 1980s drive-thru wait was different from any wait that exists today. There was no phone. There was no podcast. There was no stream. There was the radio, whatever you'd been listening to before you turned into the lot. There were the people in the car with you. There was the dashboard and the parking lot and the smell of the grease that reached you even with the windows up. That wait was just the wait, unmediated, unoptimized. People talked to each other. They argued about what to order. They sang along with the radio. The teenager in the back with a learner's permit watched how the driver navigated the lot, cataloging it for the day when it would be their turn. We had nothing to fill those 2 minutes with, so we filled them with each other. Let's slow down here for a moment, because this is the part that's hardest to communicate to someone who wasn't there, and most essential to remember for someone who was. A fast food meal in 1980s California had a specific physical quality: the bag. That particular weight of a paper McDonald's bag, the grease already starting to bloom through the bottom, the smell that hit you the moment someone handed it through the car window. It wasn't just hunger responding to food, it was the activation of every associated memory, every other time that bag had been handed through that window, every other parking lot, every other Tuesday. The fries came in a specific kind of container, a red container with McDonald's fries specifically, and the fries were longer and slightly saltier in the early 1980s before the company adjusted its formulation in 1990. If you ate McDonald's fries before and after 1990, you know exactly what changed. Most people just know that something did. The styrofoam cup. In the early 1980s, styrofoam was still the dominant cup material, and a styrofoam cup had a specific quality. It kept things cold in a California summer in a way that felt almost miraculous. The outside stayed dry, the drink inside stayed 40 degrees. You could hold it in your lap the whole drive home. Paper replaced styrofoam through the late 1980s and into the 1990s for environmental reasons that were correct and necessary. But the cup was different, and the meal was different, and every single one of these small differences accumulated into a complete experience that was specific to a time and a place and is now, quite simply, over. Not mournable exactly, not something you'd trade back for, just gone. The 1980s ended in California fast food the way most eras end. Not with a single event, with an accumulation. The chains got bigger, and as they got bigger, they got more uniform. The regional differences, the ways that a California Carl's Jr. was subtly different from what Carl's Jr. had become nationally. The ways that California Jack in the Box still felt local even as it expanded, began to smooth out under the pressure of standardization. In 1990, McDonald's changed its French fry formulation. The company had been cooking fries in a beef tallow and vegetable oil blend that produced a specific flavor, a flavor so particular that people who grew up eating it still describe it as unreproducible. For health and cost reasons, the formulation changed. Nobody was told. You just noticed one day that they tasted different, and then you forgot what the other ones had tasted like. And then, slowly, you forgot that there had been different ones at all.
The interiors changed. The harvest gold and burnt orange of the 1980s gave way to the primary red and yellow of a corporate redesign in the early 1990s. Brighter, more efficient, engineered for higher throughput, shorter dwell time, faster table turnover. The word for that, dwell time, is the corporate language for the time you spent sitting in a restaurant eating your food and talking to the people you were with. Someone decided there should be less of it, so they made the seats harder and the lighting brighter, and they took the warm colors out, and nobody asked. Here is what I want to leave you with. The fast food restaurants of 1980s California were not better than what came after, not objectively, not nutritionally, not in any way that holds up to rational inspection, but they were ours. They were woven into the specific texture of a specific California life, the car culture, the suburban sprawl, the warm evenings, the freeway exits, the FM radio, the families and teenagers and tired workers and old men with newspapers who all needed somewhere to be. They were part of the infrastructure of community in a state that was always in the process of reinventing itself. Fixed points, lit-up landmarks, places that were always there. The clown on the pole, the golden arch against the sky, the Carl's Jr. star, the smell of charbroiled beef reaching you on the on-ramp. These were not small things disguised as small things. They were small things that were actually enormous, the kind of enormous that only becomes visible in memory, looking back from a distance when you finally have the angle to see the whole picture. That's what we were doing every time we pulled into one of those parking lots. We were part of a California that was still being made, and we didn't know to stop and look. We just ordered, we just ate, we just went home, and we were happy. If you grew up in California in the 1980s, or if you just grew up anywhere and these streets felt like yours, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments, what did you always order? Not your favorite now, what you ordered then, the specific thing, the Tuesday thing, the after-school thing, the post-game thing. Because somewhere in the comments of this video, someone is going to name a menu item you'd completely forgotten about, and for one moment, it's going to be 1984 again.